Should I spank my kids? That is one of the emotionally charged questions we're going to be discussing today. Buckle up. In the last video, we affirmed that parents are the authority over their children and that children can start to recognize that authority when they're about 18 months old. Really, the closer to that point that kids realize they're not the boss, the better. But how can we as parents establish our authority? Simply put, it's largely done by making rules and consequences for their behavior. We're in charge of taking care of them, of providing for them, and a large part of that is setting boundaries around their behavior to keep them safe. It's our job to determine what time they need to go to bed in order to stay well rested and healthy. What kinds of food must they eat and not eat in order to stay well nourished? What kinds of activities should they and should they not participate in? Although our kids may not realize it, we don't set rules just to kill their fun and joy. We set rules to protect them and to help them flourish. With that in mind, here are 5 suggestions for setting up rules and consequences that actually work. First, decide your rules ahead of time, not at the moment. It never turns out well to make up rules on the fly. Your children will cry injustice and you'll have a mess on your hands. If you're married, determine your rules ahead of time and include your spouse. Second, less is more. Don't become overly legalistic about every possible scenario. It's better to have a small number of rules that people remember and can adhere to, rather than a swarm of rules that everyone forgets and ignores. Third, explain the rules and consequences to your children clearly and repeat them often. Dr. David Walsh says that the way to avoid power struggles is to let children know in advance what the limits are, let them know what the consequences will be if they don't observe those limits, and follow through as calmly and clearly as possible. Fourth, be consistent in enforcing your rules and consequences. If you only enforce the rules until your children whine long enough, you're actually training them to whine and whine until you give in. Arlene Pelican, the author of Parents Rising, wrote that when we give in to our children's demands, we are guaranteeing a repeat performance. Kids will continue repeating negative behaviors if we tolerate them. Fifth, enforce the rules calmly and firmly. Your children will press the limits to see if you're serious. If you tend to lose your temper easily, you may need to take a few deep breaths or say a prayer or leave the room shortly before you dole out the consequences for their bad behavior. Whatever you do, do not punish your children in anger. One of the approaches to discipline that I like is what Dr. Kevin Leman calls reality discipline. As often as possible, let reality be the thing that disciplines your children. In other words, do not remove the negative consequences of their bad decisions. Let reality be the one that punishes them. Don't rescue your kids from the consequences of their failed responsibility. If your child has a paper due and they blow it off, don't call the school and try to get them off the hook. Let them fail. Or if your son or daughter has a goldfish that they promise to feed and they don't, let the goldfish die. Is that going to be a very hard lesson for them to learn? Yes. Is it something they won't forget? Yes. Obviously, there are limits to this strategy. You don't want your child to be physically harmed, and you're not going to allow them to starve the family dog to death. However, if when you purchase the dog, they agree that their job is to feed it, and they don't hold up their end of the bargain, I think it's fair for you to sell the dog. That's the natural consequences of their failed responsibility. Another good concept by Leman is no B until A is finished. What he means is if you give a child a task, A, they need to do that before they can move on to the next thing, B. So if you tell your child they need to clean their room, A, they shouldn't be surprised that you won't let them go play at the park or go watch TV until after they've completed that first task. That's the natural consequence of them doing or not doing what they've been told to do. But what about spanking? Spanking is a controversial issue in our day. The Bible clearly says that parents are to discipline their children, but there are various interpretations on exactly what that means. Several verses talk about using a rod to discipline your child, but most people take that to be at least somewhat metaphorical. I'm not aware of any Christian groups in America that are literally beating their children with rods these days. George Barna studied discipline among Christian families and found that some successful Christian parents did spank while others did not. What is more important, apparently, than spanking or not spanking is being loving, firm, and consistent when you do administer discipline. So I can't give a definitive yay or nay on spanking, but I can say that all discipline must be done in love. And you should give plenty of grace to parents if they happen to discipline differently than you. For my family personally, we do spank the kids when they're young, but only very occasionally, and almost only ever for direct defiance or sassing, either myself or my wife. My kids know that if they talk back, if they're openly defiant, I'll warn them once, but if I hear that again, I'm going to spank them. No exception. And the amazing thing is, when I do that, I almost never have to spank them more than once or twice because they know I'm serious. And if you know my kids, you know they don't loathe me or cower in fear. When I get home from work, they crawl all over each other wanting to spend time with me and to tell me about their day. Rather than fearing me, they respect that I am consistent in the way I deal with them. And, of course, I never spank them out of anger. If you have more questions about discipline, and if you find the concept of reality discipline appealing, I recommend Dr. Kevin Leman's book, Making Children Mind Without Losing Yours. It is full of practical discipline tips, not just for married families, but for single parents and blended families as well.